San Quentin Prison Food. Dark Secrets of California's Death Row Kitchen exposed the first bite. If you think prison food is just bland, wait until you hear what was hidden inside these meals. Subscribe now, like this video, and buckle up, because what you're about to discover is darker than anything on the menu. The scream came just after dawn. On the east side of San Quentin, where the fog from the bay crawls across the yard and settles like a damp shroud, an inmate collapsed face-first onto the concrete. He was convulsing violently, his hands clawing at the air as if trying to scrape out some invisible poison. Within minutes, other prisoners began dropping, 6, then 12, then dozens more, coughing, vomiting, shaking uncontrollably. Correctional officers scrambled into the yard, their radios erupting with frantic chatter. By breakfast count, more than 100 inmates were down. Some were barely conscious. Others were foaming at the mouth. Panic spread like wildfire. Inside the prison kitchen, stainless steel counters gleamed under harsh fluorescent light. Trays of powdered eggs and watery oatmeal sat untouched, while staff members stood frozen, unsure whether to keep serving or shut everything down. One whispered, almost too quietly to hear, "It's the food." By noon, San Quentin was in full lockdown. Sirens wailed as ambulances lined up at the gate. Local hospitals braced for an influx. Rumors spread outside the walls that poison had been slipped into the prison meals. Families of inmates flooded the phone lines, demanding answers. The California Department of Corrections issued a terse statement: "We are investigating a possible case of foodborne illness." But inside, the story was far more complicated. San Quentin's kitchen is a machine. Built to feed nearly 4,000 men 3 times a day, it pumps out close to 15,000 meals every 24 hours. On paper, it's efficient. In practice, it's chaos, a place where the line between nourishment and neglect blurs with every ladle of watery stew. Former kitchen workers describe it as a battlefield. Inmates wake at 4:30 a.m. to scrub pots the size of bathtubs. They chop onions with dull knives that bend at the blade. They stir industrial vats of beans so thick the spoons can stand upright. Sanitation is always the wild card. Rats skitter along storage shelves. Boxes of powdered milk expire unnoticed. Meat arrives frozen, often past its prime, and thaws in sinks that never quite drain. But the kitchen is also a world of secret. Food isn't just food here. It's currency, leverage, a weapon. A cook can slip an extra scoop of mashed potatoes to a friend, or hold back dessert from someone on the wrong side of a gang beef. Officers sometimes look the other way, sometimes they don't. In a place where every privilege is rationed, a slice of pizza or a hot dog can mean loyalty, or betrayal. That's why the 2024 outbreak shook San Quentin to its core. More than 50 men were hospitalized, and whispers of deliberate poisoning echoed through the cell block. Some swore it was spoiled chicken, others blamed powdered milk. But darker suspicions simmered, that the contamination wasn't an accident, but a message. At the center of this storm was a man named Miguel Spider Ortiz. Spider wasn't just any inmate. He had been in and out of San Quentin for most of his adult life, serving a long stretch on a racketeering conviction. Thin, wiry, with tattoos crawling up his neck, Spider worked the kitchen detail. He had access to the storerooms, the ovens, the cutting boards. He also had connections, not just inside San Quentin, but far beyond. Investigators quickly noted something odd. Spider had called in sick the morning of the outbreak. For a man who rarely missed his shift, it was a red flag. Even stranger, he had been overheard boasting weeks earlier that something big was about to go down in the kitchen. When questioned, Spider smirked. "Food goes bad," he said. "You think the state cares what we eat?" Technically, he wasn't wrong. San Quentin's food budget has been slashed repeatedly over the years, forcing the prison to rely on bulk suppliers who sell rejects and near-expired goods. The Department of Corrections calls it cost efficiency. Inmates call it slop. But Spider's timing and his access made him a prime suspect. Meanwhile, outside the walls, families demanded answers. Advocacy groups like Prisoner Hunger Strike Solidarity claimed the outbreak wasn't just bad luck. It was negligence. This is what happens when human beings are treated like animals, one spokesperson said at a press conference. The media pounced. Yahoo News ran the headline, "San Quentin Food Poisoning Triggers Lockdown." Editorials in Bay Area papers questioned whether California's most notorious prison was becoming a public health hazard. Even the San Quentin News, run by inmates themselves, admitted the outbreak had shaken confidence in the very basics of survival. But the deeper investigators dug, the murkier it became. Samples of the contaminated food were sent to labs. Some tested positive for Clostridium perfringens, a bacteria commonly found in undercooked meat. Others suggested traces of cleaning chemicals, possibly bleach. Was it a simple case of sloppy cooking, or had someone weaponized the food supply? For detectives assigned to the case, one detail stood out. Just days before the outbreak, the prison had hosted one of its rare food sales. These events are small miracles in a place defined by deprivation. Inmates can order treats like pizzas, cheesesteaks, even fried chicken, luxuries that feel like feasts behind bars. For a few hours, the prison yard buzzes with laughter and the smell of grease. But for those who can't afford it, the contrast is cruel. While some gorge, others return to bland beans and soggy bread. Resentment festers. And it was in that resentment that investigators believed they'd find the motive. Some inmates whispered that the outbreak was an act of sabotage, payback for a system that let a few indulge while the rest starved on state-issued mush. Others thought gangs were behind it, using the kitchen as a stage to send a message. Control the food, control the prison. As Chapter 1 closes, the prison remains under lockdown. Spider Ortiz refuses to cooperate. Dozens of inmates still recover in hospital beds, their stomachs scarred by what they consumed. The truth, whether negligence, sabotage, or conspiracy, remains hidden in stainless steel pots and whispered threat. But then, one night, a guard discovers something chilling behind the dry storage shelves. A crumpled piece of paper, stained with grease, covered in names. Some are crossed out. Others are circled in red. The outbreak wasn't random. It was targeted. And someone inside San Quentin's kitchen had drawn up the menu. Poison in the system. The list was no bigger than a grocery receipt. Grease-stained, folded twice over, and shoved behind a stack of flour bags in the San Quentin storeroom, it looked harmless at first glance. But to the correctional officer who found it during a midnight sweep, it was as damning as a blood-stained knife. Names. 13 of them. Some were written in block letters, others scribbled hastily, as if added in a hurry. 7 were crossed out. 6 remained, circled in red ink. No titles, no explanations, just names. But every man on that list had one thing in common. They'd all been among the first to collapse during the outbreak. When the paper reached Warden Lewis Franklin's desk the next morning, he stared at it for a long time before speaking. Franklin was a lifer too, in a way, 30 years with the Department of Corrections, and San Quentin had been his post for the last decade. He'd seen riots, stabbings, suicides, even an execution back when California's death chamber still ran. But this was different. "This isn't just food poisoning," Franklin muttered, his jaw tight. "This is a hit list." The FBI was called in. Food tampering in a prison wasn't just a health issue, it was a federal crime. Within days, agents and windbreakers walked the yard, interviewing kitchen workers, guards, and anyone with a grudge against the men on the list. In San Quentin, that narrowed down to almost everyone. The investigation unfolded like a crime novel. Spider Ortiz was grilled first. He denied everything, flashing his trademark smirk. But when agents showed him the list, the smile faltered. One of the crossed-out names was his. "Looks like someone wanted you gone too," one agent said, sliding the paper closer. For the first time, Spider didn't have a comeback. He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. "You think I wrote that? I don't even know half these dudes." Maybe he didn't. But Spider's prints were all over the storeroom. He had access to the flour bags where the note was hidden. And his sick day on the morning of the outbreak was still unexplained. Meanwhile, the prison's medical wing was overflowing. Inmates lay on cots lined wall to wall, 4 bags dripping into their arms. Some whispered about the taste of bleach in the food. Others swore the chicken had been slimy, sour. A few admitted they'd been warned not to eat that morning, but by who, they wouldn't say. Detectives combed the kitchen. They swabbed countertops, tested vats, and traced shipments back to suppliers in Sacramento and Fresno. One box of frozen chicken tested positive for contamination, but not the kind that explained bleach or chemicals. Someone inside had meddled with the food after it arrived. The kitchen was no longer just a workplace. It was a crime scene. One name on the list stood out: David Little D. Ramirez. Little D wasn't famous on the yard, but he mattered in the kitchen. Young, barely 24, he'd been locked up for armed robbery but kept a low profile. He was also one of the only inmates trusted with handling spices and condiments, the rare seasonings that gave prison meals the faintest resemblance to real food. When agents questioned him, Little D shook uncontrollably. "I didn't write it," he said, "but I saw who did." He refused to say more without protection. That night, word spread that Little D had spoken to investigators. By morning, he was found beaten unconscious in the shower block, his face swollen beyond recognition. He survived, barely, but his jaw was wired shut. The message was clear: silence or suffer. The FBI now knew they were up against more than bad food and negligence. Someone inside San Quentin had weaponized the kitchen. Someone powerful enough to create a hit list, sabotage food supplies, and silence snitches. The prison went on 24-hour lockdown. Meals were reduced to sealed sandwiches and boxed milk cartons delivered directly to cells. Kitchen duty was suspended. Tension crackled across the tiers like static. Deprived of their normal food, bland as it was, inmates grew restless. The food line was where gossip spread, where small favors built alliances. Without it, paranoia ruled. Outside, families staged protests at the gates. "Food is survival," one woman shouted into a megaphone. "If they can't keep prisoners safe from their own meals, how can they keep them safe from each other?" Media outlets circled like sharks. Every new leak, every rumor made headlines. San Quentin kitchen poisoning, sabotage suspected. Prisoner on hit list beaten after talking to FBI. Talk shows debated whether California's prisons were collapsing under their own weight. But inside, the investigation took a darker turn. Agents pieced together a timeline. The contaminated food had come from vats stirred between 5 and 6 a.m., a window when only 6 inmates and 2 correctional officers were present. Every one of them became a suspect. Then came the second discovery: a vial. Hidden inside a hollowed-out loaf of bread in the storeroom, agents found a small glass vial wrapped in duct tape. The label had been scratched off, but lab tests identified it as a cleaning chemical, concentrated and corrosive, enough to taint hundreds of meals. The vial, the list, the timing, it painted a chilling picture. This wasn't sloppy cooking. It was deliberate. Someone had turned San Quentin's kitchen into a weapon. By now, Spider Ortiz was looking less like a mastermind and more like a pawn. His name being crossed out on the list suggested he'd been a target too. If that was true, who had the real power in the kitchen? Investigators turned their attention to a man named Clarence, Chef Maddox. Chef wasn't an official chef, no inmate ever was, but he ran the kitchen like it was his personal empire. Stocky, bald, with arms thick as tree trunks, Maddox had been inside for life after a triple homicide. In prison, he was untouchable. He controlled the best jobs, the choicest scraps, and had guards in his pocket. And Chef hated Spider Ortiz. The two had clashed for years over who really ran the kitchen crew. When Chef's cell was searched, officers found notebooks filled with inventory lists, coded messages, even sketches of the kitchen layout. No direct proof tied him to the vial or the list, but he had motive, means, and control. As Chapter 2 barrels toward its midpoint, investigators are trapped in a dangerous game of misdirection. The list suggests targeted killings. The vial proves deliberate tampering. But who orchestrated it? Was Chef Maddox pulling strings, or was he another pawn in a larger conspiracy stretching beyond San Quentin's walls? The twist came late one night, when a correctional officer approached the lead FBI agent with trembling hand. From his pocket, he pulled a second list, identical handwriting, different names. Except this time, every name belonged to a guard. The prison wasn't just feeding inmates poison. Someone was planning to poison the staff too. The taste of fear. The discovery of the second list, this one with the names of correctional officers, changed everything. Until now, officials had been willing to believe the outbreak was an ugly but contained feud among inmates. But the moment guards' names appeared, the crisis leapt from internal scandal to potential act of terrorism. If staff were being targeted, the very structure of San Quentin, its brittle balance of authority and control, was at risk of collapse. The prison entered maximum emergency protocol. Yard time was canceled. Visits suspended. Every cell searched, every hallway monitored by extra patrols. Inside the concrete walls, the atmosphere curdled. Inmates banged on doors, chanting, demanding food, demanding air, demanding answers. Officers tightened their grips on batons, knowing they were suddenly more than enforcers, they were prey. The list of guards contained 6 names. All veterans, all known for being hardliners. One had recently led a crackdown on contraband cell phones. Another was notorious for strip-searching inmates without warning. A third was rumored to have broken a man's ribs during a cell extraction. Someone's keeping score, one investigator muttered, staring at the list under fluorescent light. The FBI task force shifted gears. No longer was this about tainted beans and spoiled chicken. This was organized retaliation, a campaign of vengeance that could destabilize the entire prison. And the timing couldn't have been worse. Just months earlier, the California legislature had been holding hearings on prison reform. Advocates demanded an end to solitary confinement, better health care, better food. Warden Franklin had sworn under oath that San Quentin was safe, secure, and stable. Now, with reporters circling like vultures outside the gates, that testimony looked like a lie. The breakthrough came from a surprise source, a rookie guard named Alicia Chen. Chen had been on duty the morning of the outbreak, assigned to watch the kitchen line. She'd kept quiet during early interviews, afraid to speak against older officers. But after the second list surfaced, she broke down. "I saw it," she whispered. "I saw one of them pour something in the stew." The room went still. "Who?" the agent asked. Chen hesitated. "Officer Miller. He said it was just cleaning solution. Said the pot was dirty and it would burn off in the boil. But he laughed after. I thought it was a joke." Then everyone started getting sick. Officer Daniel Miller had 20 years in the department. He was respected, feared, and known for being ruthless with inmates. The idea that he might have tampered with food himself was almost unthinkable. But Chen's account, nervous, halting, and drenched in guilt, was hard to ignore. When confronted, Miller didn't flinch. "They're lying," he spat. "You think I'd risk my pension for a prank? I've spent my life keeping these animals in line. Now you're taking their word over mine." But investigators had more than just Chen's testimony. Security footage, grainy and flickering, showed Miller lingering by the vats longer than necessary. His hand moved toward his belt. For a brief second, something small glinted in the fluorescent light. The vial in the bread loaf. The handwriting on the list. The contamination. Suddenly, the theory twisted in a new direction. What if this wasn't an inmate conspiracy at all? What if the poison came from the guards themselves? Inside the prison, whispers spread. Some inmates said they'd known all along. Guards feed us poison every day, one muttered to a reporter through the bars. Others insisted Miller wasn't alone, that a handful of officers were staging their own gladiator fight, not with fists but with food, testing how far they could push before someone noticed. For Warden Franklin, the possibility was devastating. If guards were behind the outbreak, San Quentin wasn't just negligent, it was complicit. Meanwhile, Spider Ortiz saw his opportunity. Word leaked that he was offering insurance to other inmates, whispered warnings about which meals were safe, which weren't. For a price, of course. In a system built on desperation, Spider turned fear into currency. But Spider wasn't untouchable. One evening, as he was escorted back to his cell, a sharpened toothbrush slashed across his arm. He survived, but barely. Blood soaked the tier floor, and rumors spread that Spider knew too much. The investigation pressed deeper. Lab results returned on the vial, a powerful industrial degreaser, lethal in even small doses. It wasn't inmate contraband. It was standard-issue prison supply, meaning the only ones with unrestricted access were staff. Agents began to suspect the lists weren't drafted by prisoners at all. The handwriting was compared against samples from both inmates and officers. The closest match? Officer Miller. The noose was tightening. But just as the FBI prepared to confront him with the evidence, Miller vanished. Not escaped, not in a prison where towers bristle with rifles, but gone, removed under the cover of night. His locker emptied, his records sealed. The department claimed he had been transferred to another facility for his own safety. But no one could confirm where. To the inmates, it looked like protection. To the investigators, it smelled like cover-up. That weekend, San Quentin exploded. Word of Miller's disappearance sparked a riot in West Block. Inmates set fires in trash cans, hurled makeshift spears from broken broom handles, and chanted, "Food is poison. Guards are killers." Officers stormed in with tear gas and rubber bullet. By dawn, 3 inmates lay unconscious, and 1 officer was bleeding from a fractured skull. The prison was now a war zone. Through the chaos, one truth became clear. Whether it was Spider, Chef Maddox, or Officer Miller, someone had turned food, the most basic element of survival, into a weapon. And someone higher up wanted the truth buried. The cliffhanger came late one night when Little D, still recovering with his jaw wired shut, passed a note to a nurse. 3 words, shaky but legible: "Check the freezer." When investigators pried open the walk-in freezer the next morning, their breath turned to frost in the air. Beneath boxes of frozen beans and bags of powdered milk was a hidden crate, padlocked and covered in ice. Inside, they didn't find food. They found files. Documents stamped with official seals. Records of disciplinary hearings. Lists of problem inmates. And one chilling directive typed in bold letters: "Control through deprivation. Control through deprivation. Food is survival. Take it away, twist it, poison it, and you control everything." This wasn't just a scandal. This was a weapon. The files from the freezer were spread across a steel table in the FBI's temporary command post, their edges curling from the frost. Agents, wardens, and investigators leaned in close, as if the papers themselves were toxic. Each page painted a picture not of incompetence, but of intent. The documents weren't forged. They bore official stamps, internal signatures, and memos dating back nearly a decade. At first glance, they seemed like routine bureaucratic chatter: food budgets, disciplinary notes, maintenance logs. But buried in the fine print was language that made the stomach tighten. Problem inmates may be managed through dietary controls. Food incentives should be tied to cooperation and obedience. Deprivation methods can reduce disruptive behavior. And in one file, bold and unapologetic: control through deprivation. The implications were explosive. This wasn't sabotage from a rogue cook or vengeance from rival gangs. This was policy, quietly sanctioned at some level of authority, maybe not written into law but whispered into practice. Someone had decided food wasn't just for feeding. It was for breaking. Warden Franklin sat silently as the agents flipped through the papers. His face, usually a mask of granite, looked cracked with something close to fear. He'd signed some of these memos himself, innocuous at the time: requests for tighter food monitoring, budget justifications. But linked together with the outbreak, they formed a chilling narrative. This isn't what it looks like," Franklin muttered. "You don't understand the pressure we're under. We have riots to stop, gangs to control. Do you know what happens when 4,000 men decide they're starving?" One of the FBI agents leaned in. "So you starve them first?" The room went still. The deeper investigators dug, the clearer the pattern became. For years, San Quentin had used food as a tool of leverage. Good behavior meant an extra dessert. Bad behavior meant watery gruel, spoiled vegetables, smaller portions. A system of quiet punishments and rewards that never appeared in public report. But somewhere, someone had escalated the game. What began as rationing had transformed into contamination. A practice meant to keep order had mutated into a weapon of terror. The question was, who made that call? Suspicion fell back on Officer Miller, the missing man. His name appeared in the margins of several memos, initials scrawled beside notes about kitchen compliance. If he had been following orders, who was giving them? Some pointed to Franklin, but the warden seemed more pawn than king. Others whispered about Sacramento, the Department of Corrections itself, desperate to keep costs down and order intact. The most haunting possibility? That no single man had to give the order. The culture itself had evolved into cruelty, each guard pushing the limits until poisoning became just another tool in the arsenal. Inside the prison, the truth boiled like soup left too long on the burner. Inmates weren't stupid. They saw the patterns. They remembered the days when food was decent, then watched as it grew thinner, blander, sometimes inedible. The outbreak was no surprise. It was the climax of years of quiet suffering. And now, with the files discovered, the story leaked. A whistleblower slipped copies to the press. Within a week, headlines screamed across California. Control through deprivation, secret San Quentin memos revealed. Talk shows erupted. Families of inmates cried on camera. Politicians demanded hearings. Advocates compared the documents to psychological warfare. And in the streets outside San Quentin, protesters carried signs that read, "Food is a right." The state scrambled to contain the fallout. Officials denied knowledge. Some claimed the documents were taken out of context, others that they were drafts never implemented. But the damage was done. San Quentin, once infamous for its executions and riots, was now synonymous with poisoned meals. Inside, the lockdown stretched on. Boxed sandwiches and milk cartons kept inmates alive, but trust was gone. Every bite was chewed with suspicion. Every swallow carried the weight of fear. Spider Ortiz, stitched and scarred from his stabbing, smirked in his cell. "Told you," he whispered to a reporter who managed to slip him a question. "Food's the real weapon in here. Always has been." But the story wasn't finished. One evening, an FBI agent returned to the freezer to recheck the files. Something had nagged at her since the beginning. The crate where the documents were found was too heavy for paper alone. Beneath the stacks of memos, buried under a false bottom, she found a second compartment. Inside lay sealed meal trays, ordinary at first glance, stamped with dates months old. But when tested, every tray contained traces of the same industrial chemical found in the vial. They weren't accident samples. They were evidence. Someone had been saving proof or stockpiling poison. The trays were labeled with specific cell block numbers. Not random. Not widespread. Targeted. And then came the final blow. In the corner of one memo, written in handwriting no one recognized, were 3 words underlined twice. Next time, guards. The revelation detonated like a bomb. If the outbreak was aimed at silencing inmates, the next phase was aimed at the staff. The lists weren't paranoia. They were blueprints. And the poison stockpiled in the freezer wasn't a relic, it was preparation. Whoever controlled the kitchen, inmate or officer, had declared war on San Quentin itself. By the end of 2024, the investigation was still unresolved. Officer Miller remained missing. No one was charged for the outbreak. The department promised reforms, more oversight, better inspections. But the men inside San Quentin knew the truth. The food was still their leash. For the families outside, the scandal confirmed their worst fears. That behind the walls of California's oldest prison, survival wasn't just about time served. It was about what ended up on your tray. The final image is haunting. A meal tray slides through a slot in a steel door. The prisoner picks it up, stares at the watery stew, and hesitates. He sniffs it, looks into the camera, and whispers, "Is this food, or is this the weapon?" He eats anyway. Because he has no choice. This was San Quentin's kitchen, where survival isn't measured in years, but in bites. If you thought this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one. Subscribe, because the darkest secrets of America's prisons are only just beginning to surface.